Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Aquí tú la quieres, Buenas noches, and welcome to this wonderful Centro event. We have a magnificent panel ready for you. This is a second of various events that we're going to have this semester, but this is a very special event for me. This is a unit that we created not too long ago, about a year or so, to really push the area of oral histories. Now, for those of you who actually know the field of oral histories, I should say two words without preempting all the speeches that all the analysis that we're gonna hear in a minute. But oral histories have different purposes. That's how the Central Archive started, with collecting the memories of people about migration, way back, about maybe 35 years ago, shortly after Centro was created 41 years ago. The first exercise of collecting primary data was about oral history. So we have oral histories that date back to then, and we have different formats, different medium, and so forth. But this particular project of oral histories reserve a very special place in our archival collections. And that's because it was linked to the 100 Weekends campaign. It was an effort to really fill some of the gaps that we thought we had in our collections on the one hand, but on the other hand was intended, and they're going to explain all about this, the protocol, the methodology, and all that was intended to accelerate the acquisition process for collections. It was intended to also provide kind of an interpretation of that collection that these people, these wonderful people, donate to the center to our custody, was intended to have a voice that explains that collection that is unique to the donor, him or herself. And that's what this project is all about, and they're going to tell you all about those details. So it's not just one more oral history project. It's an oral history that has a central mission within the archives, the Central Archives. And I think it's a very novel approach to start a collection through this door, because from the beginning you have a narrative about how those people see their life and how they interpret what their contributions are. And then comes the documents and the photos and everything else. Digitization, and we have all recorded. So they're going to tell you all about it. So we have a distinguished panelist on my far left, Cynthia Tovar, who's now assistant professor of library sciences. We have Chatki Castro, who is our coordinator of oral histories. And we have a professor from, ¿cómo se llama? College of Staten Island, right. And my very dear friend, in any case, we are recording live streaming, so we have to start promptly, and I wish you all well. But in any case, I think who's going to speak first, Ismael or Cynthia?
Let me introduce them.
Okay, Ismael is going to introduce, so with you, Ismael Garcia. Come on. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Since the 1970s, Central staff began using oral history as an alternative to mainstream research methodologies. The practice of oral history offers the unofficial version from workers, women, minorities, and community leaders that official records and manuscripts cannot offer. In the 1980s, the Oral History Task Force emerged as a multidisciplinary unit within Centro. This unit carried out projects such as Puerto Ricans in New York, Voices of the Migration, and extended routes from Hawaii to New York. Later, from the year 2000 to 2001, I had the privilege to be part of Centro's Hispanic Labor Documentation Project, which collected oral histories of Latinas and Latinos in the New York City labor movement. Following this tradition, today's panel will introduce us to Memorias, Centro's current oral history project. What I want to emphasize is that scholars of Puerto Rican studies share the use of oral history with public historians, archivists, librarians, anthropologists like me, and other people outside of the formal academic discipline of history. And the panelists share this disciplinary boundaries, if we could say. They are librarians and public historians. So the first panelist is Cynthia Tovar, former Centro's project archivist and archivist at Bronx Community College.
Do you want to say something about the start of the project first?
Sure.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
So thank you everyone for coming. We're so glad to finally be presenting on Centro's current oral history project, which has been going on for about 1.5 to 2 years. It was originally envisioned as a push for more archival collections, as Dr. Melendez told us, in order to celebrate Centro's 40th anniversary, and it's grown exponentially beyond that. We have almost 300 people on our list of candidates to interview, from a humble amount of 100 Puerto Ricans, which was the original working name of this project. And we're going to share some clips with you tonight. This is sort of a new approach to oral history and archival gathering. These oral histories are meant to function as a sort of digital finding aid to the collections that we hope to add to Centro's archive. And I'm going to let Cynthia show you some clips and talk about them.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right.
So since I was brought onto the project previously, managing and helping guide the work that was already started by Sarah Molinari and Shakti Castro, who are also part of the panel and who will be speaking a little bit more about the background to oral history, what it is for those of you who aren't familiar with the field. But how I kind of got started with oral history was basically very down-to-earth seal to document the history of an activist organization that I was a part of back when I was an undergrad student here in this very campus at Hunter College. I was a member of the Welfare Rights Initiative, which is a student grassroots organization here at Hunter College that helps guide and empower welfare recipient college students to stay in school and help them guide them through the financial crisis that they experience, as well as trying to stay in school and deal with guaranteeing that they have their benefits while they stay in school. And being part of that legislative action a few years ago, I, as being trained as an archivist, was wondering what had ever happened to the organization and if anybody was documenting its history. And no one had been. And as a former member of the organization, I took it upon myself. I got some grant funding back when I was a professor at a different CUNY campus, and I started this project from scratch, just basically learning as I go and getting a lot of feedback from public historians and oral historians at the Graduate Center, such as Steve Breyer, who's also the head of the doctoral program in urban ed at the Graduate Center, and reaching out to colleagues at Columbia's Center for Oral History. Back then it was the Office of Oral History. And I started documenting these stories, specifically talking about their first person narrative accounts of having to deal with the stigma of being a welfare recipient, of having to deal with wanting to get a college education, to stay in school, and getting their stories, and bringing a sense of social awareness to the issues surrounding welfare and its effects on those who wanted an equal access to education, not necessarily special, but equal access. and how WRI, Welfare Rights Initiative, was created to help them to get actively involved with policy making and empowering them to be their own best advocates. And so I started this archive. I collected about 14 interviews, of which 8 are available online for people to listen to, and to give them that equal access to the only thing you would need to do to learn more about the organization is just have an internet connection, have access to a computer or through your smartphone or through any kind of a device, and have access to these first narrative accounts. So I already had kind of like this, and that kind of just got me started with becoming fixated and fascinated with oral history. It's a predominantly for folklorists. I mean, you could take it as far back as the WPA era in regards to how the government itself had funded a lot of these documentation efforts. Documenting, again, it may not be a factual retelling of what happened, a historical event, but that first-person narrative account, that storytelling element, is in fact very historical and very pertinent and very important, and it's compelling to many people to hear how somebody lived through a certain historical experience. So since then, I got involved with other types of oral history documentation, and with my archival background, I was able to try to combine the digital with the oral history component and meet a lot of fascinating people along the way. The people at the Occupy Wall Street movement, we started an archives working group, and within their ranks, we started an oral history component where we were interviewing the occupiers right there at the scene of the protest and getting their first-person narratives. So not only looking at it from an archival standpoint, being, okay, you receive these interviews and now it's your job to preserve them and make them accessible, but also kind of switching seats and being the producer and calling the shots and saying, I feel this historical event or happening is worth documenting. And this kind of do-it-yourself approach is kind of what appealed to me about oral history and my own oral history work. So then I had this wonderful opportunity to work with Centro for the 100 Puerto Ricans project campaign, and now being called Memorias, and essentially, again, taking the everyday stories of so-called ordinary people or extraordinary people and the extraordinary ways that they contribute to their community. I have a few clips here. Let's see. I think I'd like to start with, I guess we were asked to talk about like what themes would we think were pertinent throughout our time working on the project. And for me, obviously, with my activist background, I thought the community building, the social justice and activist aspects of the stories that we were collecting. And I noticed there was a thread of that with all the stories that we were collecting. I wanted to start with Milagros O'Toole. Let's see, there are 2 clips here, and I think it's only 1. Okay. So let's see where we're at with this. A little bit about Milagros Baez O'Toole. She was born in San Germán, Puerto Rico, and she came to New York City with her family in the early 50s. And she served on several executive boards and essentially has a very long history of serving a civil service background, of giving back to the community. And throughout her interview, she talks about her civic service that spans over 35 years and how she served as a deputy commissioner for administration and planning services at various New York City government agencies, including the Department of Probation, the Human Resources Administration, and Department of General Services. And she was the first woman in Puerto Rican appointed by Cuomo to the position of Deputy Commissioner for Operations for New York State's Office of General Services when she served from 86 to 95. I believe this clip, there are like 2 clips here, hopefully it's the right one. She speaks about concepts of everyday heroism. And that I thought was very compelling to me, because when people think about activism and social activism, what compels people to do something and what can I possibly do? And this concept of everyday heroism I thought was really poignant when she talks about it. And I'm going to just let you listen to her words here. Hopefully it'll play. How do you get this to go? Do you just click on it? Oh, there we are.
I really feel.
And the audio's cut off. Maybe it's the other one. Let's try it again. That one?
I really feel that we have so many problems in the world that it's everybody's responsibility to help, because it's not smart not to help. We can't continue in the world with some of the things that need to be changed. I'm not saying the world is all bad. I see a lot of goodness in the world, but there's some things that need to be changed. And whether or not you have the ability to change them, saying that people say you have to be a lawyer to change them. No, lawyers can't change that. People need to change that. And you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And if you, I think, I was going to say if you have a family, but not necessarily. So, I think most people want to do something about changing whatever is wrong in the community, in the world, whatever. I'm not saying that we don't have a lot of good things. I think we need to look at the good things, otherwise, you miss them. And I think this is a beautiful world. I'm not just saying that. I really, I see a lot of you. I love New York. I can't believe there was so many parks and so many wonderful things to enjoy in New York. But I also see that there's a lot of problems in New York. And so how could you live and just enjoy the good things and not try to help in your own way? I mean, you don't have to give a lot of money. You don't have to give that. But then on the other hand, I'll tell you. So some of us are sitting here and we're retired. And some of us, let's say, that had the advantages of being at the right place at the right time, and we had opportunity to have good position and to have good retirements and have maybe a little money in the bank. And so you have children, you help your children, but how much money do you need to live? How much money do you need in the bank? How much money do you need to keep that you feel that you can let people go with needs? So I think it's an individual thing, and I think you have to think about it for yourself. People can't force you to do anything. But I think that if you don't think about it, you wouldn't know how you feel. And so I believe that, I believe in being wise about your money. But I would rather die knowing that I did good things in the world than die rich. So, and my husband feels the same way. And my children know it. And my children, we talk about it. And you develop and you grow assets and you have assets and if you had a good life. And I talk about it. I said, well, this is the way it's going to be. We need to, I'm proud to say that my children are of the same mind. They really are of the same mind.
And that, to me, I can't even begin to describe to you the number of interviews that we've done. And if you go through the database, and once these interviews will become publicly accessible, you keep seeing this theme pop up again and again and again in your own small way. In one of the interviews that we had with Professor Carasquillo, Angela Carasquillo from Fordham University, she talks about her humble beginnings, being in a small village and how they wouldn't have enough to eat. And all it would take would be the neighbors making a pot of rice and bringing that pot of rice to their door without even having to be asked. Those small sentiments, those small emotions that people take for granted. It starts very locally, it starts very small, but those things start to build up. And that was something that I thought stood out particularly well, especially not just amongst Latinos, but within the Puerto Ricans that we interviewed for this project. It just kept on coming back again and again and again. I succeeded, I struggled, I fought, I had to work really hard. I had people who were standing against me, but then I had all these people helping me and not leaving the door closed on the way out, like just leaving the door open for those to come back after you. This notion of altruism and everyday heroism and how inspirational it could be, starting off very small to very big actions. And I thought that stood out very big. And yes, she's runs the 100 Hispanic Women organization, and she's a leader in her field and community. But then you have other people who we interviewed for the project. Tony Ruiz, who's a runner, just a runner, but he just also happens to be the first Puerto Rican running coach of the Central Park Track Club, and he had a very poignant story. I mean, his background, he talked about his experiences having been a coach, but he had also, in the 1980s, had been a nominee to be on the Olympic team going to Munich, but then due to a personal setback could not make it, and how that personal setback kind of set him back a few years and prevented him from fulfilling his dreams for Olympic gold as a runner. And for anybody who has been just that close to having one of those turning points happen in your life, you'll understand that these are pretty significant moments. But sure, he had some setbacks, but then he also had a lot of people in his life who came in and guided him and helped him out of that funk and helped him propel himself. And he went on to Iona College on a partial scholarship. He never quite finished college. He only went on a partial scholarship, and he was able to participate as a runner on their team. But again, as a runner, thinking about community, again, that sense of community building, that sense of wanting to give back. And even though he may not be on the board, he may not have an official title, even in his own small way, wanting to give back. And in this clip, he talks about his participation in the program Mentors of Distinction to help inner city youth, and about character building. So let's see if this clip works. It'll work. Hope it does, because it's a really good clip. And he's wearing that George Westinghouse high school t-shirt he wears with pride. That was part of his high school track team. So let's see, it's not really working for me here. Right here. Triple click it a little bit. There we are. So, well, we haven't done again. Let's see if we can start it again.
Of course it didn't do this when I tested them before.
Of course. It'll be right.
So,
Nope, not working.
Exit out. Wait, hold on a second. I'm sorry. Technological difficulties comes along with the age.
Yeah, it's awesome. Great, thank you. Is it set up at the time, or do I need to look for it? Yeah, it is.
Is just accepted, and one of our missions is to
Let's see if we could get it back even further. Here we are.
people that we had this connection, and I always knew that there was something special. You know, when you meet somebody and 27 years, and it's like he's really the only person that I stayed in touch with at the housing authority. And so Irving said, you know, we have this group, and we're trying to get together and be like mentors, you know, for our community. And I said, really? I said, man, I would love to do that. I got a little time now, you know, maybe I could get involved. And he says, well, you're obviously the one guy that I want to sponsor, and so you can be a part of the group. So now I am a member of Mentors of Distinction. I was just accepted, and one of our missions is to obviously mentor in the inner city. Most of the guys, I think right now we have 12 members, and all of these members are people who have professionals, well-educated, African American, Puerto Rican, you know, Hispanic, and so we basically are just want to be role models, you know. And I know that we saw the other days, I saw where the president talked about what we were lacking in this country, and one of the biggest things was that in the inner cities we're lacking mentors. You know, a lot of these African American and minority kids, you know, people that have really no chance. You know, I mean, I had a chance, but it was only because people came to help me, man. I mean, you know, I wouldn't have made it out of East New York, Alphabet City, you know, without the help of all these people in my life. You know, all these people that came at an early stage, you know, and even some of them didn't come at an early stage. They came later on, but they got me in time, you know. When I was 14, 15 years old, 20 years old even, you know. And so now, with the Mentors of Distinction, one of the programs that we're trying to put together is that we're each going to have like mentees, go into the inner city communities. We're going to get some funding, or at least, you know, put in for some of the funding that the president is making an allotment to, because he talked about this probably about a month ago, and it's great that he's thinking in this way, because, you know, I know some people, I mean, yeah, I'm not big into politics, you know, for a lot of reasons in my life, but I do feel that that particular program is something that has to be done. It has to be done in this country, and a group like Mentors of Distinction, we can take advantage of that and give back and do so many positive things. Like, they've already assigned me to track coach, and one of the things that we'll probably do is try to get a track team, Mentors of Distinction track team, that kind of thing. But however we do it, I know that from that perspective, I'll be involved in that. And there are a bunch of other things that we're discussing right now. And so if you look on Facebook and you see MOD, like our homepage, Mentors of Distinction, and then you're welcome to also, send me any type of messages on Facebook if you want to be a part of that.
Had to do that plug-in for Tony because I think it's a great organization worth endorsing if you have the time. But a little background on Tony: when he did end up coming back from training and having had his Olympic dreams dashed, he did come to New York. He did get a job at the New York City Housing Authority, and he struggled for a few years. And then he ended up becoming part of the running culture in New York at that time, and having to deal with being one of the few Latinos in that running culture, and how, with the value and the strength of having a mentor, Irish-American mentor, guide him and include him and encourage him to include even more Latinos to come and do running for the team. He was able to help gauge that gap amongst racial differences and discrimination that he had to deal with, conflicts of being a minority within athletic groups, and then having to coach people who were once his rivals, and all these experiences about confronting economic poverty, having grown up in the projects in the Lower East Side, which he talks about further in his interview. He overcame so many obstacles, but then again, once he reached that level of success and worked hard for it, and now is one of the most in-demand coaches, came up with several techniques where people who are training for the Olympics, people who are training for these worldwide marathons, they do refer to him, and he's quite a legend in those running circles. He's able to want to give back, and again, that twist, that little note, like, not being so self-absorbed, but wanting to give back. This theme keeps coming back again and again in ways that are small and large. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and I checked out this article in Slate magazine. If anybody has ever seen the Batman movies, you'll see, is anybody watching my do-gooding? It's like an analysis about the roots of altruism. Why do people do it? What prevents people, or what propels people to be heroes in life? And while it's more of like a little study about do people do it for egomaniacal reasons or whatnot, I throw that question back to the audience, but in regards to the interviews and how that ties back to the 100 Puerto Ricans, I kept on seeing it, and it was just too large of a thread to ignore. This need, this desire, not just to address a social injustice, but wanting to be an active part and being propelled and encouraged and inspired to do this. It really just stuck out for me. The last clip I want to share with you is Reverend Carmen Hernandez, and a little bit about her background. So she, in her interview, she addressed some of her experiences as an advocacy activist, including who were her role models. She talks about her work to reach out to children in the community, and that's one of her main passions, is dealing with the youth in her community in the Bronx and the LGBT community. From a personal viewpoint, she expresses how being a Christian, a lesbian, and a Latina woman has built her character and enriched her leadership to advocate for her community. And she talks about all of these experiences, including, that wasn't one of the clips that I included because it's pretty significant, but I didn't want to hoard time. I know that there are other clips and other people who want to speak, but she does talk about being the first lesbian Latina to get married in the state of New York, and it's definitely worth listening to once you're able to get access to this interview to listen to it. In this clip, she's discussing, again, when we were talking about this theme of social justice and activism, she talks about the violence and discrimination against transgender individuals and the activities that she's participated to confront that kind of discrimination. So let's see, 2849, I think it's 26, yeah, 2649.
News that's happening now. There's a rally that's been happening about the recent NATO, I think was his name, that even in front of the police department, they killed him. The guy beat him up to death, and the police hasn't done their job. It's like, my God, we're human, we're citizens, no matter who you are, wrong is wrong. And now the police is going around, they don't know where the guy is that killed the kid, because they didn't do their job. So, you know, that's a big issue that I'm working on with certain activists that brought it to my attention. And they're frustrated. They're frustrated because there's no justice for the transgender community. And I hope that people could, you know, be comfortable with it. Because in my time, the transgender was well recognized. I remember Patsy, who used to be our neighbor, and Patsy used to read my mother the cards back then. But Betsy everybody loved Betsy. You know, nobody felt, you know, I always remember, you know, her, you know, the transgender woman, everybody accepted. I don't know why now they're getting so aggressive. I just don't get it, you know.
What are your thoughts? Because there is a thing that keeps coming up again and again. You talk about the rise in hate crimes against the LGBTQ community and how these attacks are happening in those particular communities. What are your thoughts?
It happened here a couple of years ago. We did. I formed this organization that I'm always doing something, but I call it the LGBTQS United as One. I can send you the video of it on a few websites that they have it. Some news like they videotape it when we did the rally by Brainbridge, by university, that college, what they call it, the college by university. Which one?
And she's talking about Bronx community, but it didn't occur to her at the time. But I'm going to probably pause it there because I don't want to take too much time. But again, like these notions of giving back, fighting back, sticking up for one's, and again, not a lot of financial resources. She works straight out of her apartment in the housing projects in Soundview, and she doesn't take a cent. And the second part of her interview, I went to her home and I interviewed her in her home. And again, this wonderful, this culture of just like, you know, would you like a cup of coffee? Would you like a sandwich? Are you hungry? It's this warmth. It's this, is it something that's innate in people? Is it something that you're born with? Again, is it something that happens to you late in life and then you're just like struck by kindness? Is this something that can be encouraged? Is this something that's passed on? Or is this something that has to be innate in you? And they're important questions, especially for our communities, Latino communities, because we have in our culture, I feel, there is a very strong sense of that community building and giving back. And again, you don't have to change the world on one large leap, but it's the smaller actions that lead to the larger ones that I thought were really poignant. And we were asked to talk about preliminary findings for me. In regards to the archive and how it's much more community driven. That was one thing that attracted me very strongly to this project, the sense of the community defining what should be archived, and by the nominee process, people nominating within their own communities. We would seek these nominations not just by the people at Central, but also by people who knew people at Central saying, interview this person's story is worth preserving and telling. And it's this self-driven moment where everyone's an equal player and a participant in presenting their history to a larger mainstream audience that's just so important for those of us here who have previously worked at Central and for other organizations to take into account when we talk about what is an archive, what is its role in the community, how it's a gatekeeper to information, and kind of delineating. They're setting up the frame and telling you this is the part of history that counts. But with oral history, you do have this ability to frame it for yourself. And when you involve communities as active participants in documenting that history, that also kind of has that engaging effect, that community effect, which I think is very powerful. And in regards to community-based archives, how it serves as an alternative venue for communities to make collective decisions about what's of enduring value historically for you, politically for you as a community. You don't have some expert telling you what's worthy. You pass it on to your community members. So that to me was pretty much what stood out for me in regards to experience and reflections. I think it's just presenting the simple truth to people, and by these firsthand accounts, that they're very powerful in and of themselves. And I think that one of the main missions of this project was to break apart those stigmas about what people think when you say that word Puerto Rican or any kind of Latino? What do people think when they hear those words? And then when they're confronted with these stories of the same kind of struggles that they deal with are the same struggles that you deal with, and you may or may not be Puerto Rican, and you may or may not be white or black, and you still deal with these same struggles, and finding that commonality amongst people, I think that oral history, other than just that ability to document in an alternative format that may not be official, it may not be written, is still a witness account, but also it builds community, it builds dialogue. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Shakti Castro. I'm the current oral history project coordinator. And I came to this project after working at Centro for about a year as a research assistant. I come from a literature background. I'm very interested in storytelling and in how we as Puerto Ricans, as people in communities that are not often seen as people who have stories that are worth telling, how do we take control of the narrative? And I don't know if any of you have followed something called the We Need Diverse Books campaign, which was recently all over Tumblr and Twitter and on the internet. It's talking about how the publishing world is so lacking in diversity. We don't have enough voices of color. We don't have enough disabled voices. We don't have enough queer voices. So for someone who comes from this background of literature, who is a teller of stories, who likes to think of themselves as a facilitator of the telling of stories, which is what I think my role is here at Centro, is to help in the telling of stories. You know, being a part of an oral history project like this is particularly exciting for me. What I've learned from working on the project is to have a sense of community as someone who is mixed, who is Puerto Rican and not Puerto Rican, meeting all of these people whose work that I've admired for so long, whose work in this field, particularly of getting our histories out there, has been really humbling to me, to meet these people and to form relationships with them. And it's probably the best part of this project, is to add to this incredible archive that when I was in high school I didn't even know existed. It really took coming to Hunter and being a student and learning about what Centro does and how powerful it is and how this is such a varied community and so many people have different voices and they're all worth hearing. And in sort of light of that, the first clip I'd like to present is Virginia Sanchez Corol, who is an amazingly important Puerto Rican historian who's helped to document this community and who wrote a seminal text called From Colonia to Community. And this is her talking about the challenges of working on this, which is her dissertation. So I'm gonna see if this will pull up. Let's see.
Your book, From Colonia to Community, is a seminal text in the field of Puerto Rican studies. And I want you to talk some about what the process of writing was like for you and what your reaction to its reception was.
Well, the process of writing Colonia to Community was brutal. I think I threw the manuscript in the garbage can about 4 times. It was my doctoral dissertation, and I had never written a book before. And I had never done any publishing. Actually, I had never published anything before. I had given some papers at conferences, but I had to write this book because I had to complete my doctoral thesis. This was my doctoral thesis. And I also had to write the book because that was the reason why I went to graduate school in the first place. I wanted to be able to tell the story of the Puerto Rican community to my children because I was sure that that community would no longer exist by the time they became young women. And particularly since they were Puerto Rican and Russian Jewish by birth, I knew that they had several heritages to deal with, and I wanted to make sure that this one was not lost. And So I was determined that this was the story that I was going to tell. I entered Stony Brook on the condition that I would be able to study the Puerto Rican, then we weren't even calling it the diaspora, but to study the Puerto Rican diaspora and to be able to do some meaningful work on it. They accepted me even though there was no one there that could actually guide my work, but they were very supportive, and I began to work with Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. It was just beginning, and I became a research assistant with the Centro so that I could have access to the materials and so that I could work with Dr. Frank Bonilla, who was the director and who was an expert in the field. As I began to put the story together from colonia to community, I was remembering the community that I knew when I was growing up in the South Bronx and later on in Brooklyn, but mostly in the South Bronx because those were my formative years. And my family was an extended family. We're very close. And again, this was the story that I wanted to convey to younger generations. And as I began to put the book together, I found that there was really nothing that had been written of in the depth that I wanted to tell the story. I knew that although I had had personal experiences that I could relate to, that wasn't a scholarly book. So I needed to do sound research so that no one would laugh me out of the academy after this book was completed. And it was through Centro that I began to find the tools to tell that story.
So that was a very exciting interview for me to do, to sit down with Virginia after having used her book for my own research at Centro. Sorry, I'm never very good with mics. So sitting down with Virginia and seeing how she sat down to write this book and what the meaning of it was for her, how she needed to get this history down. It was about preserving history. It was about telling a story, particularly for her own daughters who are also mixed, and how this is such a new path to blaze, and how important that was. That was really exciting for me to sit down with her and see that this is a history that does have a place in the academy, even though increasingly ethnic studies programs are being underfunded and cut. There is a place for these stories, and it's both inside and outside of academia. In that sort of vein, I'd like to introduce the next clip that I'm going to use, which is an interview that I did with Carmen Dinos, who was suggested to me by another 100 Puerto Ricans interviewee, Dr. Luis Reyes, who is here tonight, who also works at the Centro. Carmen Dinos is a pioneer in the field of bilingual education, which was so important when there were waves of Puerto Ricans coming to the city to have the right educational tools to help them address their needs in both languages. And here's her speaking about her work training bilingual and culturally competent teachers to help serve the growing Puerto Rican population in New York. And I wanted her to talk a little about what were the challenges that she faced dealing with this subset of people of color during such an extreme civil rights movement, during such an intense period of our country's history.
About your time as the director of the New York City Board of Education Program of Recruitment and Training when you were working in training Spanish-speaking teachers. If you could tell us about any challenges that you faced doing this sort of work in the midst of the civil rights movement, and any hurdles you had to jump over, even pertaining to funding or just general support of the public for training teachers.
The training of teachers in itself, it isn't that it was problem-free, but by that time, it was a necessity. The board had to have the programs. You see, the availability of funds made it easy to recruit and train, because by this time the districts had written proposals and gotten funds to develop the bilingual programs. So unless they got the teachers, they wouldn't get the funds. So all of a sudden it was easy. What had been very difficult was before then to get the board to really look at the needs of the Puerto Rican children and not to see those needs as a Puerto Rican problem, but rather than a problem that Puerto Rican kids were confronting when they went to school. So the hard time was to get the board to move towards the implementation of programs and services that took into account the needs of the kids and tried to solve them. Once that was done, and negotiating programs and issues, that was a problem. And but along with the other groups of the other people involved in civil rights, it was a formidable group that was advocating for the same thing. It was no longer just the Puerto Rican, but it was the Puerto Rican representative along with the NAACP, the CORE, the Jewish, all the Jewish organizations that helped a lot in this and trained us in the fight. Without that group working together, it would have been very, very difficult. It was, those years were the ones that were building. Okay, these people want this, let's give it to them, let's have them work it out, and it'll be all right. So it was the years of building, of doing things, not as it is today. That today we have lost a lot of what we gained, and now it's a matter of rebuilding in an atmosphere that is not friendly to all of this. At that time, with the civil rights movement, people were ready to give the right to the groups to do things by themselves.
Speaking of forming relationships, interviewing Carmen was such a great day. I drove out there with one of my colleagues, Melissa, who's not here tonight, and she called us while we were on the road. We're like, we're running late. And she's like, okay, did you guys eat yet? And we're like, no. She goes, well, I don't have much, but I'll put something together. And we get there, and there's a full spread for lunch, and we sit down, and we, bochinche, and we eat. And then we have coffee, and then we film for 2 hours, and then we have ice cream and more chat. And it's so exciting. People have shown us so much hospitality, and it really is about forming a relationship with these people and with this community. It's not about, let's just get in and get this interview, or let's just get your papers. It's really about the relationship now and going forward, and what it means to have this almost sacred charge of these stories and of these documents. What does it mean for the future of our community, for future researchers who are both formal and informal scholars of this history? So it was just great to sit down with her and to listen to her talk. And my theme for these clips, and I'm moving on to another one in a moment, was Puerto Rican women in education. It's not easy to be a person of color in the academy. It's not easy to be a Puerto Rican in education, especially fighting to get recognition for Puerto Rican studies. And learning from these women who've done such important work has been particularly rewarding for me as a Puerto Rican woman and future scholar. So I'd like to move on to Alma Juba Lopez, who is a professor in the Brooklyn College School of Education and co-author of the book on Becoming New Yorkers. And this is sort of a funny story of how she stumbled into her field of sociology. Really
It
hope
was
this
great,
loads.
and I wasn't work. Then I had a ball. It was fabulous, and I had a great time and great period. And coming back, I was almost in my senior year, and I said, "What am I gonna do? I have to apply. I have to register." So I called up my sister, and she was married to a man who was doing graduate work at Hunter. And I said to him, "Can you please register me for a major for something? I have to complete school." And he said, "Well, what do you want to major in?" I said, "Well, it's either history or sociology. Either one." I had taken like 9 credits of each, and I liked both. So he said, "Either one?" I said, "Yeah. Do not register me for a mixture. Either get me 12 credits of history or 12 credits of sociology, and that will be my major." And he couldn't get the history, so he got me the sociology, and I majored in sociology. And that's how my major went. I hadn't a clue as to what. I wanted to go into law. Originally, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a lawyer. I was not sure. I was very unclear about what I wanted to do. I just knew that I just wanted to get a college degree and finish. And at the time, a college degree meant something. So you could graduate in a liberal arts and get a job and do something with it. Unlike today, where young people have to really think about what they want to major in if they want to get a job after. I knew that I would find a job. Everybody had a job in the Department of Welfare. If you graduated with a BA degree, it did not matter in what subject. It was really kind of scraping the barrel, but if you could not find any other job, the Department of Welfare would hire you as a caseworker, starting at $7,200 a year, $7,600, something like that, per year. So I knew that if worst came to worst, I would have a job in the Department of Welfare. Somehow, I would find a job there. So that's how I got my major. I had no idea what I was doing.
And how was your last year?
My last year was great. There were so many Latino students, you know. It was great. It was a great experience. And I was enrolled in all of these Puerto Rican studies courses. So I had Puerto Rican History 1 semester, Puerto Rican History 2. I had Sera Bonilla, 2 semesters in the sociological, anthropological course. I had Centella 1 semester in the language course. And it was African and Puerto Rican studies. So I took with Henry Clark, who was a great African American historian. I had him. I had great teachers, great professors. I was so interested in learning about areas that I had really never academically learned about. It was fabulous for me. Just the idea of sitting down and listening to Henry Clark, for example, about slavery, about the transporting of slaves from Africa to the United States, and listening to Dr. Serra Bonilla talk about his views about what is a Puerto Rican and what makes a Puerto Rican. Can you be a Puerto Rican and not know the language, etc., etc. And the way he saw it from an anthropological perspective. And these were...
Of course, there's a lot more to go on in that interview. And I like this one because it starts off really comedically, and she's like, I didn't know what I was going to do for college, who knows? And she's like, whatever, just register me for whatever, I'll figure it out. At least I'll have a job when I graduate. And she stumbles into Puerto Rican and Black studies, and she finds her calling, and she goes on to become a very serious scholar and the author of a great book called On Becoming New Yorkers. And it sort of brings this subject back full circle to the importance of these studies and why these studies programs exist and why an archive like Centro is necessary to begin with, and how for us as Latinos, or Puerto Ricans more specifically, what it means for us to discover these histories that are so often denied to us. So that's the end of my part. I'm gonna show a couple, or you can go ahead. So Sarah Molinari was my research partner on this project, and she's running a little late tonight. She's a graduate student. So I'd like to share some of her clips so we can also talk about those when she gets here in a little bit. How are we on time?
6:36.
Okay, maybe we won't show those clips. I don't know. We'll show one of them. And for Sarah, she picked clips that had to do with El Barrio, which also brings the subject back to the use of oral history as both an academic tool and one for community building. And El Barrio is such a hugely important place in the Puerto Rican cultural imaginary that it was really important for her to focus in on that. So from education to community. Let me pick one of these. And this is a clip of Marina Ortiz of East Harlem Preservation and Virtual Boricua, who does community organizing and historical preservation work in East Harlem. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with this mic.
By me? Yes, yeah. So the East Harlem Preservation Organization, as I said, came about through my work with East Harlem Historical Organization, the political activism, and how it started really was a web page that I created to highlight one issue going on in the community, because I had done websites for my regular work, day jobs. And so that kind of one page blossomed into a whole bunch of different pages based on different issues of concern in the community. And Virtual Boricua was a separate website that was created to honor Richie Perez and Pedro Pietri, who were people that I'd always looked up to. Richie Perez in terms of political activism, social justice, and Pedro Pietri in terms of the cultural work, and specifically the New Yorker identity, which I was, that was instrumental in my personal development. As I said, he was one of my mentors, and his kind of work really spoke to my identity as a New Yorker, and why do we call ourselves Puerto Rican? Why do we insist that, you're Puerto Rican, you're born and raised here? And so his work and the kind of work that I did spoke to that. So they were very important people in my life, and when they died 1 month apart, there was nothing on the web to honor them. There were articles here and there, but they had no websites. So I just created pages for them, and that kind of has morphed into page after page after page dedicated to either Puerto Rican people, leaders, cultural icons for news, events, and East Harlem Preservation then kind of became, so Puerto Boricua has continued to be a web, and then East Harlem Preservation kind of became an official 501c3, working with different people in the neighborhood to fight against gentrification, but also to promote and preserve our landmarks, our arts of work. And so then when the Spirit of East Harlem was vandalized, that became a campaign that we took on, East Harlem Preservation. And also I did work with Hope Community. So when there was the issue of money, funds to restore it, Manny Vega was first of all absolutely ready to go to restore it. And so I did what I always do, which is to make a lot of noise, and usually that gets the attention of some of the more progressive journalists. So David Gonzalez came on board and did a cover page for the Metro section, a cover article for the Metro section, and then so we were able to get funding. So that attention got us funding, and we commissioned Manny Vega to restore the mural, and so far it has not been touched. And
So I'm gonna
same thing with the Julia Lebon.
end that right there.
So let's now open the floor for questions and or comments. Anybody? Luis.
I just wanted to reflect on the complement of personal history, individual stories, and people being able to express their own story at the same time telling a collective story. Oral history is history and stories. And the examples that were given bring that out to me. And someone like Dr. Carmen Dinos, who's alive today, 94, and will probably be on Saturday at a conference being held on the 40th anniversary of what would be the Aspida consent decree, as well as the Lau versus Nichols, the Supreme Court decision that gave us the right to bilingual education. And so you get the personal story, but it's important to open up the frame and connect that personal story to the collective work. The same thing with Alma Rubal Lopez, her personal story is connected to having been a disciple and a student of Joshua Fishman, who wrote one of the most important works before Aracelia Centella on bilingualism in the Baguio. That was the title of his book. And so I think it's important to be able to connect, as Virginia says, sound scholarship about the Puerto Rican experience with personal stories that reflect and embed that story in real life.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if maybe you want to stand close here and you want so you can come and react to his comments.
So I really envision this as an informal discussion. So, smile and interact with me and laugh and enjoy this, please. That is one of the most exciting things for me, to see this sort of history brought to life. And, there's a very famous oral historian who I discovered doing this work, an Italian oral historian, Alessandro Portelli, who says that oral history is not about fact. And Cynthia brought this up earlier. Oral history is about meaning. How do we experience these events? And I can tell you that there have been times when people have not told me the truth, or they've fudged things, and I don't think it's a malicious intent to deceive so much as it's just how they remember history, how things felt to them. And sort of connecting these personal stories that illustrate the data, that illustrate the more historical, factual elements of the history is exactly what Louis said. It's compelling and it's worthwhile and it's what's necessary. Okay.
Yes, I mean, we need the documents, but also we need the testimonies, how people have felt the events. An academic historian just doing research on Puerto Ricans using newspapers are not going to get these kinds of stories. Yes?
Shakti, I noticed one of the themes sort of running through the videos you were showing was these women talking about how in their experience it was sort of a really good time for developing the kinds of things that were important to them, that the civil rights movement allowed for the easy development of bilingual education, and you were able to transition working cultural studies into gainful employment and things like that. And the sort of unfortunate thing is it seemed like they were saying, well, that stuff was a lot easier back then, and there are a lot of challenges now that are making this kind of thing difficult. And I wonder if you can speak to how compiling these kinds of oral histories might help to counteract some of the current difficulties that people face.
I'd like to pose a question to you, actually, with your experience at the Welfare Rights Initiative. I don't know if you want to get up. We don't have a table mic, so it's either shout from here or get up there.
Talk really loud.
Shakti, maybe you
Yeah.
want to stay here, and so you don't have to go back.
a duck in a row.
You don't have to go back. And
Well,
forth.
I think we all have our own way of perceiving or wrapping our minds around it. I think, for me, I guess, in regards to the question, I feel like for me, and especially with my research and the type of projects that I'm really interested in documenting, it's more important not just to have a static archive of an interview and a story on a website or on YouTube and you clicked it and it's like, oh great, it's there for posterity, but it collects digital dust. There's nothing that will compel anyone to do anything with it unless people start to get creative. And I feel that listening parties, I feel like events such as this one where people are engaged around a topic, although it is still a little scholarly, but I mean, Shakti's done a great job about making this fun, making this compelling, making this more of an informal conversation, because that's where it starts to break down those stereotypes. Because I feel like one of the main driving forces behind this project was to break down the stereotypes, break down these images, these perceived notions, these prejudices that we all carry around when we see somebody, when we see a professor, what we think of them, when we interact with our coworkers or our colleagues or whoever. We all carry around these things inside us, but when you're confronted with a real-life narrative story, it's pretty hard to carry that thought through. You're confronted with the truth, and it's a simple truth. That simplicity is very important. And how do you key that into something as important as activism, and what will compel people to action? You know, I was participating in a conference just a few weeks ago where I met a number of activists who were doing this and combining oral history in very different ways. These ideas of story circles, for instance, are very popular amongst people who are documenting stories. NYPL, they're doing a very interesting documentary oral history project where they're soliciting interviewers from the neighborhoods themselves to do the interviews. They'll give them a one-day training, and I totally encourage people to Google that. If you have an NYPL branch in your neighborhood, in Harlem, in the Bronx, I know that they've been doing a lot of work in East Harlem too, and Jefferson Market where it started. It's a great project. But then compelling people to come around and to define the notions for themselves. And I think that for me is the interesting part of it. It's not necessarily having some expert historian tell you what you should be looking out for, but you setting the parameters for it. And I think that even though it may not be officially oral history, things like StoryCorps, things that you see on National Public Radio, it's starting to propel that notion. And people are doing it regardless and not even considering that it's oral history, and they're doing it anyway.
with social media, you have Twitter, you have all these venues that people are doing where you videotape an injustice happening, this documentary activist zeal that people have, and without even realizing that that's what they're doing. So, I mean, I hope that kind of answered the question a little bit. I guess, did I overlook anything? Yeah.
More questions? Comments? Yes.
Did you set a criteria on who you will interview, and also how do you prioritize who's going to be interviewed first? Or let's say, this person is pushing 100, so you need to interview her now.
Well, when we started the project 2 years ago, I know there was a push to honor certain people, and Centro had a series of events called affinity events to sort of bring people into this project, honor them, and get these agreements to give us oral histories and documents. So we do have listed people, and there are people who are always suggesting other people to interview. As far as priority, when we first started, it was just a huge list of names. And we sort of had free reign in the beginning of this process to sort of go through this list and think, well, I'm really interested in poets or artists. I think I'd like to cover these people. Or Sarah is an academic, she's an anthropologist. She really wanted to interview people in her field, people who she'd studied with, like Clara Rodriguez at Fordham University. I know it was important to you to interview Tony Ruiz through your own experience through running, and people who had also had experiences similar to the people you'd interviewed for the WRI, the Welfare Rights Initiative. So that was sort of our initial process, but now we're sort of tightening in and sort of seeing what are the gaps in Centro's collection, who haven't we interviewed, who is pushing 100 that we need to talk to before it's too late. So it's been a sort of combined process of not having a very strict criteria, besides Puerto Rican has done work in the community and sort of choosing who we get to highlight in this project. Mm-hmm. And then also, okay, what's necessary at this point? We have over 85 interviews done. What's next?
Let me just add something. I think I want to challenge Centro to consider also interviewing people that we don't necessarily think of them as leaders, such as someone that started as a law worker in a factory and became a supervisor on a factory.
Actually, we do have a couple of those interviews.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
we do have normal everyday interviews. Henry Dominguez was one.
Okay.
But I mean, I feel with that. I think the ordinary story, the ordinary person, also has a very strong component to it. But what's interesting, though, is that a lot of the people that were interviewed who have become leaders all had their starts as ordinary people. That was one theme within the interviews that did come up often. So I don't know if that helps.
No, yes. I mean, I think that's important. When I was doing oral histories for Centro, I had similar experiences, and the project that I was doing about the Hispanics in the labor movement ended up being the same, similar, having the same shape that Cynthia talked about the formation of these community leaders. And from what I know, nobody has written about an article about how a Puerto Rican community leader emerges. And I think this oral histories and the other ones that are at Centro Archives reflect this and can contribute to such writing. So we have Sara Molinari, a PhD anthropology student at the Graduate Center and former research assistant at Centro. You want to add some?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm late. I worked on the project with Shakti for 2 years and also with Cynthia when she came, and it was a really amazing experience. I heard that we saw Marina's clip. I had a couple of other ones to show, but one theme for me, and a theme that I picked out to show from these clips was placemaking, and the place specifically being El Barrio. El Barrio came up in a lot of our interviews in terms of history, in terms of migration, community struggle, arts, And that was kind of my theme that I wanted to address here in the clips I chose. So if anyone has questions specifically about El Barrio.
Unfortunately, I thought, okay, I had to do this as an elective, but it ended up being a very, very interesting course for me and has completely opened up my mind because I've never done Latin studies before. So I always understood that I'm not Latin, or I think what you said, black, white, or do not Latin, I'm none of the three above. So for me, it's very interesting, and I, appreciated all of you who said something about heroism and how, giving back to community is important and altruism. And I also agree with the professor when he said that, picking up on people who are on a level where may not be so highlighted as professors or doctors, but then heroism is a kind of a concept which is kind of patchy. So if you pick up on someone who's a basic person, then the entire community will say, okay, I will do something today, and then maybe I will gain a bit of recognition. And obviously from my professor, I understand, now I know the Puerto is a very small country, right? So the community is also very small, and how they previously in the 50s and 40s, they had this birth control, so a lot of the population must have tracked. So it's important for your history to go forward. So I had one question, because I appreciate all of you what you're doing, and today is my credit for my course. Is that the number 100, is it, somebody said about, is it age, or is it the number of 100 number of people that you have interviewed? What's the specific number of 100? And I also wanted to know about blood borders and immigration. I think you're going to talk about that. Or you're going to basically talk about immigration, right?
Well, yeah, that's certainly one of the themes that come up because a lot of the people we talk to have migrated from Puerto Rico to the States, or to New York, wherever. We've interviewed people in a number of locations. I'm sure that's been addressed. But just to go back to the number 100, as far as I understand it, it was a target, and we, I think, quickly surpassed that in terms of people that wanted to donate collections, that wanted to do oral histories. So that was kind of a symbolic target.
Kind of like a campaign.
Yeah, for to kind of tag along to Centro's anniversary.
It was really cute. They had like a little meter thing, like, for each story, we're 50 in, or, it's more like a.
Yeah, but we have much more
Way
than that.
more.
Yeah. So the oral histories that are completed are just a really small portion of the actual people that are going to be part of this project and that have signed up to be.
Yes.
I have a question basically in terms of next steps. And how accessible will this project be for community? Or is it going to be more an academic kind of thing? Because I think the beauty of it is that we need to get this out to our community. Because it's part of the history, it's what grounds people in the history. And so I'm really concerned about how that's going to happen.
I'll answer that question. I think Dr. Melendez's vision for the project is a sort of push for Centro to enter the age of digital humanities and to present these oral histories as a completed package of a digital video and an online narrative and a guide to whatever documents eventually end up in the archive. I know for us, it has been very important for us to make this an accessible project. And when we give people consent forms, we tell them pieces of it might be online, it might be accessible to a broader audience, pieces of it might end up in promotional materials for Centro. So it's our sincere hope that this will be a publicly available project. And it will definitely be available in Centro's archives, which is free and open to the public, and we're located in East Harlem at 119th Street. But our final steps for the project, it's a little in the air. It's a little what's going to happen next. We're editing over 85 videos. We're adding metadata. We're doing something called thematic time coding, which is a sort of precursor to transcribing to eventually say, well, what are these 5 minutes of this video about? And how can we incorporate them into the website? How do we present this as part of different areas of research? So it's an ongoing process. And of course, as someone I've interviewed, Digna Sanchez, I will be keeping you in the loop. But that's the best answer that I can give you right now. Yes, Luis.
Can I add to the answer? As recently as today, going out to Centro's thousands of people on our distribution list is a Voices, which is an electronic newsletter which has a number of articles that are, some of them are interviews of people, and one of them today, which I don't know was done by your team, but is of David Gonzalez, the New York Times photographer, photojournalist, and reporter, talking about his work and his growing up as a New Yorican in the South Bronx. And so that goes out to the world. And the ability through social media, I was able to send out that section of Voices about David Gonzalez with photos that he's taken so that his work and his talking about his life together can be shared on Facebook and on LinkedIn to people on my list, and hopefully other people will do the same. The second thing is that we're also doing a series of documentaries on Puerto Rican history in the U.S. And so a lot of the interviews will be very important. For example, in one series we're going to do about bilingual education and community control in New York, Carmen Dinos and other people whom you have interviewed, we will be able to use them in the documentary.
You in the back.
As a documentary filmmaker myself, one of the things, and the reason I got into media was so many ethical things I saw wrong, like that others were doing outside media, how bad their practices were, how unethical they were when talking about our communities. What were the biggest ethical challenges that you faced along this journey? Like the thing that you're like, I don't know how I feel about that, or just if there were moments that was part of your consciousness about, because you are taking people's stories, right? So if you could just think back, what were the ethical problems or questions that you had to confront throughout this process?
I'm going to pass this one over to Sarah.
Yeah. Well, okay, there's...
I guess something happened, right?
No, I can't think of anything like specifically where I felt like I was in an ethical dilemma, honestly. But there have been a couple instances in my case where, we explained the consent agreement very thoroughly with the people we're interviewing, the people that are participating in the project, the point is to have a mutual understanding that what they say in the interview is going to be part of Centro's collection. So if you don't want to say a specific thing that could be publicly available, keep it for another time to say it. Some people have shared, really personal stories or personal struggles or conflicts they've had with other people. So I kind of hear this like bochinche that, and I remind people that this is going to be publicly available and all this stuff, and they understand that. So I wouldn't even say that's it didn't become an ethical dilemma, but I would say that the importance of mutually understanding the consent forms and what people say and the stories they want to tell are going to be publicly available.
Although the duty of the interviewers is to make sure that nothing is going to affect the reputation of the interviewee. But I guess, did you have that?
We did, we had people, a couple people have come back and said, you know what, I remember I don't want this to be in the interview, or there's this specific thing I said, I don't want it to be public, and we deal with that on kind of a individual interview basis. Yeah.
But just to add to that, just very Shakti had mentioned before the value of relationship building.
So it wasn't like we were strong-arming people to sign consent forms, and we did give them a lot of freedom and a lot of understanding to just really take your time, read that form if you have any questions. And I think that's because, you know, Sarah and Shakti before have done such an excellent job building trust with the narrators, and when there's that initial trust and that relationship building, it's not like they're going to take your interview and never see you again. It's a continual relationship. So the chances of dealing with ethical, sticky issues is lessened by that. So I think they did a great job doing that.
Yeah, I mean, being nice is the most important requirement to carry out an oral
But
history.
honest, you know.
Yeah, honesty.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you know, if
Yeah.
you have to have a good relationship, establish a good relationship with the interviewee. If not, it's.
And I mean, in other archives, they do have these practices where if somebody does come to your archive and requests to take something down, I mean, there are restrictions you can place. You can do all sorts of things. And I mean, you know, they have an excellent staff here at Centro for Libraries and Archives, and they respect that. So.
Questions? Comments? No? So let's give them an applause. They have done an excellent job with this oral history project. Thank you for coming.
Can I play like just more background?
Oh, you want
I mean,
to? She wants to add a clip. So if you want to stay.
Mingle and please, eat the food in the back. But I know we only got to see one of my clips, but there's this one in particular that it's really, really beautiful that I wanted to share if we had some time. If you have to go, that's no problem. Where is it? Do you have the time code, Shakti? This is Roger Caban. He is an artist, educator, activist, does a lot of work on housing in El Barrio, and I just wanted to share this part to kind of bring in like how important it is to collect these histories, because he's telling a really, he's talking about El Barrio at a very specific moment in the 1950s, and also his father migrated in the 1920s, so he's talking about this, what it was like demographically, what were the important places in El Barrio, and it's just a really, really beautiful clip. Hold on.
And who you're living with here, and what,
Well, like I said, I was born in Isabela. Until my father was born in Panama, and he was a New Yorker Rican. Back then, he was raised in Harlem, and at the time he was worked in construction, but he was a heavy operator heavy equipment. He was with a company that evidently had a contract and went to Puerto Rico. And I guess back in 1941 or something, he was down there working, and he met my mother, and he married her, and he brought her here. I guess he was there for my first 2 years. And then my mother and him came back to New York, along with my grandmother, and followed by my aunt and her husband. And that's how I ended up at the age of 2 in El Barrio. And like I said, it was very, very different. Then I remember 110th Street was predominantly Jewish. I remember the what we call bodegas, so they were Jewish shops, and I remember seeing the Hebrew lettering on all the shops. La Marqueta, which you all know, it's gone now, but La Marqueta, the merchants were predominantly Jewish, Hasidic Jews, and 116th Street from Park Avenue to Lexington and down and around, that was all Hasidic. And La Marqueta was, like I said, most of the merchants were Hasidim. The Marqueta was divided in half. One half, the east side of it, had dry goods, what they call dry goods, and haberdashery, pots and pans and stuff. And the other side was produce, and vegetables and so stuff. And it started on 111th Street, and it went up to 115th Street, and then from 115th Street to 116th Street, that one last car was poultry and fish. It was like a big fish market. And it was an interesting place because it had a lot of street vendors besides the regular merchants that were there. There were like, there was one guy that had a pony. He was also Hasidic. And he walked around with a pony and had a 5x7 camera. And everything, people from my era, they all have that shot with the pony, you know. I have it somewhere in one of my boxes. And there was a guy, there was a parrot that told fortunes. There was Italian guys that played violins. La Marqueta was actually started in around 1930s by the Mayor LaGuardia, and it was designed to get the street merchants off the street, the guys with the push carts. So they got them all off the street, and they built La Marqueta, which was a series of cars. It was under what was then called the New Haven Railroad line. I think today they call it North Central. And it was on there, like I said, from 111th Street to 116th Street. And there's talk of bringing La Marqueta back, you know. It was a very exciting place. To me, it was a place where the world met, because all these people from pilgrims from faraway lands like Connecticut and New Jersey, and when I say pilgrim, I'm talking about the Hispanics, mostly Puerto Ricans, would come from Connecticut, from New Jersey to La Marqueta. That's where they could get all the related Puerto Rican food products and stuff that came from the island. They even sold sugar cane. As a kid, I used to sell shopping bags there. There was a place on 111th Street where I would go there and I'd buy a shopping bag. If I had a nickel, I would buy 2 shopping bags that were 2 cents a piece. And I would go and I'd get that, sell them for a nickel, got a dime, then I went back there, and with that dime I bought 5 of them. And I worked my way up. By the time at the end of the day, my pockets were bulging with coins, and I would go home. I had a fortune, you know, probably maybe $4 or $5, but it felt like a fortune, you know. Selling shopping bags there, and it was just an exciting place, and you know, it was magical. You know, my grandmother used to buy this big bar of butter, and it was a big block, and it was white. And then inside the package there was a little package of coloring, and then she would spend about an hour churning this white butter with this dye to turn it yellow. And I thought, as a child, she was actually making the butter, you know, and she was just giving it color. And you know, it was just an exciting place. The whole neighborhood, in the summer you had the same merchant would come around the streets, of violin players, they would serenade the tenants, and they would throw coins, and most of the things that they sold were on horse-drawn wagons. They would come around, guys selling watermelon. They would sell little baby chicks for some reason. Before they became criminal, you know, you could buy a little baby chicken for about a nickel, you know. I actually raised one home. I built a box and I actually raised them at him for months and months, and it became like a real chicken. And one day I came home and the chicken was gone. My grandmother told me it had flown away. And little did I know that night I was having chicken soup. And it was a chicken. She would have told me that. I found out.
I really wanted to share that because I think this is an example, and this is also representative of a lot of the interviews we did. This kind of subjective rendering of history that we cannot get from other sources like statistics or things like this. This is firsthand daily life history. It's beautiful, it's living, it's alive, and I think this was a good example of that, and the other kind of histories we've acquired.
Thank you.